King Solomon was considered one of the wisest kings to have ever lived. So much of the wisdom of Western esotericism traces their lineage back to this man, it is unreal. Now, before I get too deep into all of that, I want to talk about the glory and the failures of Solomon so we have a complete picture of what his life actually looked like. Because King Solomon has a lot to teach us, especially occultists. Now, you already know what it is. If you're interested in learning more about the blessings from the Most High and the failings of humankind, then rock with me a minute as we take the journey within. What up, though? It's Justin. Welcome back to the Mystical Mind State. Last week we kicked off talking about David and Psalms 51 specifically, right? It's the more famous of the Psalms of Penitence, verses 12 through 14, where he says, "Create within me a clean heart," right? Because the heart is really the crux of the matter when it comes to esotericism and spirituality in general. The heart is the seat of the mystical experience. I'm going to recap and bring everyone up to speed, so there's no real need to actually go back and watch the other video unless you want to. But King David wrote that Psalms right after his affair with Bathsheba. Bathsheba was a woman that he wanted, and she was married. So David pursues her, seduces her, has sex with her, puts her husband in the front line of battle so he is killed so he doesn't have to deal with the shame and guilt that comes from his affair. Now, it'd be cute if the story ended right there, but Bathsheba gets pregnant, right? And the first child they have actually dies. I don't remember the specifics, but we do know for a fact that their first child was taken from them. But they carried on their relationship. She was now single, and David was free to do as he pleased, thanks to murder. But she bore another son. And that son was actually King David's 10th son, the guy we know as King Solomon. And being that far back in the lineage, it's surprising that he ended up on the throne, but he was considered the son to be most after his father's heart, right? Now, you got to understand, the key difference between the two is David was a military strategist and Solomon was more politically savvy, right? We see this in the fact that David lived in a time of war. David had been conquering and fighting his entire life. He knew warfare just as well as he knew poetry. Now, poetry is what we know him for, but you'd be a fool to think that man hadn't spent his entire life at war. In fact, his country never knew peace while he was alive. But Solomon's entire reign were through these really prosperous years of peace that were built on the back of his father's warfare, right? Now, Solomon maintained that peace through political savvy. We see the key difference in the story of his brother Adoniah, right? Adoniah was going to usurp the throne from Solomon before he ever actually made it that far. David was still alive, and David told Solomon, bruh, you've got to kill him, burn down his houses, and salt the earth. Everyone involved in it. Joab, yeah, execute him. The priest, execute him. Kill everybody. This is going to come back and bite you in the neck if you don't. Well, Solomon exiled the general Joab, exiled the priest, and let his brother Adoniah make it. Until Adoniah gets the bright idea to try and whisper in Bathsheba's ear to take a certain bride that he wanted. Right, he desired and coveted this woman, and he was like, bro, just give her to me. Tell your son to give her to me. So Bathsheba goes, and he's like, don't turn your ear from me, son, yada, yada. And Solomon flips and does exactly what his father told him to do and kills everyone involved. Now, some people would call this, barbaric and bloody, but that's just the reality of scepter and throne. So, around the time he was working on making Israel a major power, he took his first wife, who was one of the Pharaoh's daughters, right? We got to take Josephus' word for it. So I think it's Seaman that was Pharaoh at that particular time. The only thing we do know about is that Pharaoh Seaman didn't pay the dowry out of pocket. He went to Gezer, conquered Gezer, took the spoils, and then handed over that country and the spoils to Solomon as a way to pay that dowry. So Solomon, being politically savvy, took that money, used it to rebuild Gezer as a part of his empire, and brought them into the fold. We see this played out much, much, much later and can relate it in more modern terms by looking at Halliburton getting the defense contracts to rebuild Iraq right after we bombed them because there's nothing new under the sun, right? So this alliance was a good fit for Israel, but it was also one of the first big mistakes that Solomon made. In 1 Kings 2:9, we see Solomon following in his father's footsteps. Give your servant a listening heart to judge your people and distinguish between good and evil. Think of David saying, create within me a clean heart. Solomon, being a man after his father's heart, was all too aware of our hearts being the epicenter of our spiritual being. Think of Ajna Chakra, thousands of miles away from there, having a 6-point star at the center of it. This star represents the spiritual and material planes intersecting because our heart is a way to connect. It is the bridge between the physical essence of our being and our spiritual being, right? So naturally, God answers and says, there will be none like you all your days. And if you walk in my ways and keep my statutes as your father David did, I will give you a long life. There's that whole walk in my statutes thing again. Like we see this in Ezekiel 36:27. I will place my wind within you and cause you to walk in my prescribed path. We're talking about wind, spirit, Ruach HaKodesh. This is the infilling of the Holy Spirit. King David's willing spirit that upheld him, right? Now, diverting back to Kemet, or what we know as Egypt today, we see the thread of their wisdom going throughout Solomon's writings. Proverbs 22, verse 17 to chapter 23, verse 11 is almost word for word exactly what we find in the instructions of Amenanope, right? There's a book written about 1100 BC. I think they found it in 1923 and realized instantly what it was. Now, that whole pattern of father to son, administrator to successor was common in Kemet. From about 2500 BC to the 1st century, we see at least 17 pieces of work that follow this same exact pattern. They're expounding on the gods putting an order or a natural law in place. The word in the ancient tongue would be mat. Initiates need no further explanation. Now, in order for the Pharaoh's daughter to become Solomon's wife, she would have to become a proselyte to the Jewish religion, right? So there had definitely been a play between religious ideologies and philosophies taking place, and this isn't exactly something that we should be shocked by. It's pretty common throughout the ages. You think that Christianity doesn't have roots of other religions in it? You think there's not Greek philosophy mixed in there and ancient mystery schools? And I hate to tell you this, but you're wrong. We've all influenced each other in more ways than we usually care to admit. In Kabbalah, we're taught that Egypt is an internal state of being, right? Anytime that we're seeking magic to learn how to draw in more money, more power, and more sex to us, we're eliciting this state of being, right? We're acting from a desire to seek worldly wealth as opposed to seeking God, right? There's a story in the Zohar about Rabbi Yossi and Torah study that reflects on this in pretty good detail if you want to look it up. But from a biblical sense, it's not so much that Kemet is evil. They're just materialistic. They're looking for ways to bend the world to their will as opposed to bending their will to the will of the Father, right? The will of God. This is what led their priestly classes astray. This is why they erected so many temples to all the different gods, assassinated Amenhotep's character, and silenced any mention of Aten altogether. They're one true God. It's like Adonai to the Israelites or Brahman in the Hindu pantheon, right? So Solomon was wiser than all men. Ethan the Ezrahite and Heman, Chalcol, and Darda, the sons of Malhal, and his fame was in all nations about him, right? Ethan wrote Psalms 89. Heman wrote Psalms 88. Chalcol was a philosopher, and his brother Darda's name literally translates into pearl of knowledge. But King Solomon was wiser than them all. Why? Well, he understood the inner workings of the cosmos and how to attain conscious contact with God, how to be a man after his father's own heart, right? A clean heart, one that is capable of receiving Ruach HaKodesh, Kabbalah being to receive. Here's a huge esoteric secret for you. Look at Solomon's temple explained in 1 Kings, right? There are 10 lampstands as soon as you walk past Jachin and Boaz into the temple itself, right? Now look at the diagram of the tree of life. Notice that there are 10 spheres of light on each side of Jachin and Boaz, right? It's literally a diagram for how we connect. This wisdom is attained through the temple of the heart. More on that later. I want you to feel that slow burn with me. For she is the breath of might of God and a pure emanation of the glory of the Almighty, and therefore nothing defiled can enter her. She lights our path to God, but nothing defiled can enter her. So ultimately it was Solomon's lust for money, his lust for power, and his lust for sex that led him astray. He became an arms dealer. He was a middleman between the nations of Kemet and Syria, right? He was trading chariots one way and a certain type of wood the other, metalworks, all that, right? He had 700 royal wives, 700 women born of royal lineage to really solidify his power in the area. He had 300 concubines, right? This man had so much gold that silver was rendered useless during his lifetime. That's how much abundance this country actually had. Stacking that blood money, right? Putting his trust in wealth, military might, and his political savvy. When Solomon was old, his wives had turned his heart to follow other gods, and his heart was not entirely with the Lord as his father David's heart had been. And then he did what was evil in the sight of God. He started constructing temples to these other beings, right? Creating places for his wives to go and worship, right? Knowing the truth. Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. The Lord is our God. The Lord our God is one. The truth of being. There is only one. It's not that there isn't other spiritual powers out there, or Solomon wasn't given power over them. I mean, God gave him what he didn't ask for. The esoteric tradition is ripe with information on the seals and the invocations Solomon would have used to trap these beings, right? He directed them. Muhyiddin ibn al-Arabi says, O humankind, I made jinn and the devils, including their most evil ones, obey a servant who obeyed me. If you submit yourself to my commands, most creatures, even the jinn and the devils, may be subjugated to you. Now, Bediou Azam Saeed Nursi, however, warns that the jinns actually cause sedition and bloodshed, right? We see this line about Solomon's staff that he used to direct them being eaten from within, right? So, while Solomon was given dominion over these beings, where they made iron supple for him and caused molten copper to flow for him, like we see in the Quran, they also worked to lure him away from the one true God. We're talking about ancient beings here, beings that are aware of their strength, beings that have been alive for millions of years and are all too savvy on how to trick men in the most simple and basic ways possible. Those would be the powers and principalities that the Apostle Paul talked about in his writings, right? So without that breath of God to help us walk in our prescribed path, like we're really not much good in the fight. Give your servant a listening heart. And unlike David, King Solomon stopped listening. He'd gotten so big, so powerful, so wealthy, that he thought it was because of him. And he forgot who put him where he was, and he forgot who guided him there, right? So there was this one priestly class. I think Moloch was the god that they actually followed. They played my man's. Like they knew what he desired more than anything. So they took a young girl and waltzed her into the room with him and told her, "Don't have sex with him until he prays to our God." Now Solomon was a wise king, so he refused several times, right? She just kept dancing in front of him like, "Come on, come on." Well, after a while, I guess, like, crushing grasshoppers in the name of Moloch really didn't seem like that bad of an idea to him. It says in the Testament of Solomon that at once the Spirit of God departed from me, and I became weak as well as foolish in my words. And just like that, the wise king became a fool who had armed his enemies with the very weapons that they would use to splinter his empire and take it from his son. The lesson here is very simple. When you start constructing these temples and you go within and you start meditating, you will develop a power. And as you develop a power, you have a choice as what to do with it. Now, most people don't realize that that comes from God, and that is Ruach HaKodesh working through them. See, Solomon went to the left hand and started using the power that he was receiving to bend the world to his will, thinking that it was by his own design, and he broke his covenant. There's dozens of laws that he broke in Leviticus coming down the line to this point, but it was when he started worshiping the very things he was given dominion over, the moment he turned his back on the one true God, that he cursed his empire to implode and be eaten from within. Next week, I'm going to do a special on Halloween and talk about some of the old Celtic religions, so I won't be returning to the subject until after that. But I promise you guys, I am definitely going to get into the more esoteric side of this and explain the inner temples and what they meant to Solomon, what they mean to the rest of us, and how we can build them. So stay tuned for all that, guys. I thank you so much for your time. I hope you got as much out of this as I did the first time I heard it, and peace be with you all.